You sure you're allowed to be here, ma'am? Did you get lost looking for the gift shop? The voice was young, sharp, with the casual arrogance of someone who had never known a world without stealth technology. It sliced through the peaceful drone of the afternoon on the historic flight line. Avery Mitchell, 43 years old, didn't flinch. Her hands, lean and precise, were steady as she meticulously cleaned the cowling of a Pratt & Whitney R1820 Cyclone engine. She ran a clean rag over the metal, her touch gentle, reverent. Before her, looming like a ghost from a bygone era, sat the shell of a B-17 Flying Fortress. A second voice joined the first, belonging to a staff sergeant with a swaggering walk and a name tape that read Gallo. "Seriously, lady, this area is for authorized personnel only. This isn't a Pinterest project zone." And she never had. The fallout from that day was swift and decisive. Sergeant Gallo and his men were formally reprimanded and assigned to a month of grueling base cleanup duties. But Colonel Evans knew that punishment was not the point. Education was. He implemented a new base-wide heritage program. From that day forward, all newly assigned airmen, as part of their in-processing, were required to spend a full day on the historic flight line. Their final lesson of the day was a mandatory session with Mrs. Avery Mitchell, who would walk them through the B-17, telling them not about the machine, but about the people who flew it, and about her own missions, carrying on that legacy. The restoration of Iron Phoenix became the entire Wings project. Volunteers from every squadron appeared, offering their time and expertise. The base fabrication shop began milling new parts. The project became a symbol of pride, a tangible link between the Air Force of today and the giants of its past. A few weeks later, Avery was on a scaffold, carefully polishing the plexiglass nose cone when a figure approached below. It was Gallo, out of uniform, wearing simple jeans and a t-shirt. He stood there for a long moment, hands in his pockets, looking up at her. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet and hesitant. "Ma'am?" Avery looked down. Gallo held up a perfectly polished torque wrench. "My grandfather was a loadmaster on C-130s in Vietnam," he said, not looking Avery in the eye, but at the plane. "He taught me a thing or two about radial engines. I was wondering if you could use an extra pair of hands. I'm a fast learner." Avery studied the young man's face, seeing not the arrogant NCO from before, but a humbled kid searching for a way to make things right. A slow, genuine smile creased her lips. She nodded. "All right, son," she said, her voice warm. "Come on up, let me show you how to properly time the magnetos on a Wright Cyclone." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the tarmac, the two figures, one a decorated veteran, one a humbled airman, worked side by side. The quiet sounds of their tools, a testament to forgiveness and the enduring power of shared purpose. Avery Mitchell's story is a powerful reminder that heroes walk among us, often in the quietest of forms. If her story of valor and forgiveness moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Veterans Past Stories for more tales that honor our nation's finest. He looked at his desk at a framed photo of a C-130 crew standing proudly in front of their aircraft. On his bookshelf, there was a worn leather-bound history of Air Force Special Operations. He grabbed the book and stormed out of the office, leaving his aide and the budget meeting completely forgotten. The cavalry was coming, and they were riding a storm. Back on the tarmac, Gallo's patience had run out. The woman's quiet defiance was an insult to his rank, to his very uniform. "All right, that's it," Gallo said, his voice hard as stone. He took a step forward and placed his hand firmly on Avery's arm. "Party's over, lady. You and me, we're taking a walk to the Security Forces building. They can figure out which retirement community you wandered away from." The threat was the ultimate humiliation, to question not just her presence but her competence, to reduce a lifetime of experience and memory to the confused wanderings of someone who didn't belong. Avery looked down at the sergeant's hand on her arm and then back up at his face. For the first time, a flicker of profound sadness crossed her features. It was not fear, it was pity. Just as Gallo began to pull her away, a sound tore through the air, the high-pitched squeal of tires on hot asphalt. A black staff car, the kind reserved for senior command, swerved onto the access road and skidded to a halt just yards away, kicking up a cloud of dust. The colonel's eagle insignia gleamed on the bumper. Before it had even stopped rocking, the passenger door flew open and Colonel Evans emerged, his face a mask of thunder. From the other side, the Wing Chief Master Sergeant, a man whose presence alone was enough to make most airmen stand straighter, got out. He looked just as furious. The mocking smiles on the faces of Gallo's friends dissolved into slack-jawed panic. they snapped to a clumsy version of attention. Gallo froze, his hand still on Avery's arm. He felt a wave of cold dread wash over him, so intense it was almost nauseating. He had made a mistake, a terrible, career-ending mistake. Colonel Evans marched across the tarmac, his boots crunching on the gravel with menacing purpose. He didn't even glance at the terrified airmen. His eyes, burning with an intensity Gallo had never seen before, were locked on one person, Avery Mitchell. He came to a stop 3 feet in front of her. He took in the entire scene in a single sweeping gaze, Gallo's hand on Avery's arm, the fear on the young men's faces, and Avery's own quiet, unshakable dignity. Then, in a move that shattered the reality of every person watching, Colonel David Evans, commander of the entire wing, snapped his body into the sharpest, most pristine position of attention he could muster. His back was ramrod straight, his chin tucked, his eyes forward. He raised his right hand in a salute so precise, so full of reverence it seemed to cut the air. "Miss Mitchell," the colonel's voice boomed, clear and powerful, echoing across the flight line. "It is an honor to have you on my base, ma'am." Behind him, the Wing Chief Master Sergeant did the same, his own salute a mirror of his commander's. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant scream of a jet engine. Gallo and his men stood frozen, their minds unable to process what was happening. They were in a nightmare. Holding his salute, the colonel slowly turned his head, his fiery gaze falling upon the petrified staff sergeant. "Do you have any idea," he said, his voice dangerously low, "who you are speaking to?" He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need one. He turned his attention back to Avery, but his words were for the benefit of the ignorant. "Sergeant Gallo, you and your men are standing in the presence of Technical Sergeant Avery Mitchell of the United States Air Force Reserve. This woman flew over 200 combat missions as a loadmaster and aerial gunner over Iraq and Afghanistan when most of you were still in elementary school." The colonel took a breath, his voice rising with controlled fury. "She flew through skies thick with anti-aircraft fire, in temperatures that would break most people, to deliver supplies to troops under siege and evacuate the wounded under fire. On one mission in 2004, her C-130 took multiple hits from enemy fire. With the crew chief incapacitated and the aircraft losing altitude, Sergeant Mitchell took over his duties in her own, manually releasing cargo to stabilize the aircraft while returning fire from the ramp gun." He gestured with his head toward Avery's worn jacket. "Her actions allowed that crippled aircraft to make it back to base, saving the lives of the 8 other crew members on board and the 12 wounded soldiers in the cargo bay. For that action, she was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for heroism." He paused, letting the weight settle. "The patch you so casually dismissed is her aerial gunner badge. She also holds 2 air medals, a Meritorious Service Medal, and a Purple Heart for wounds she received from shrapnel." The story hung in the air, immense and humbling. The crowd that had begun to gather at a distance stood in stunned, reverent silence. Mark Stetler, watching from the hangar, felt a tear trace a path down his cheek. The young airmen looked ashen, their arrogance replaced by a profound and soul-crushing shame. They weren't just wrong, they had committed a sacrilege. Colonel Evans finally lowered his salute, but he kept his eyes on Avery. He then turned his full, undivided attention to Gallo. The force of his glare was a physical thing. "You are a disgrace to that uniform, Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but carrying more weight than a shout. "You see a woman and you show contempt. I see a giant on whose shoulders every single one of us stands. You saw a hobbyist. She sees her family." He stepped closer. "Your profound lack of respect, curiosity, and humility is an embarrassment to this command and to the entire United States Air Force. You and your men will report to my office at 1600 hours. Be prepared to explain to me why I shouldn't strip you of your rank on the spot." He paused. "Now get out of my sight." They practically scrambled away, not daring to look back, their humiliation complete. The colonel's face softened as he turned back to Avery. "Ma'am, on behalf of everyone here, I am deeply, truly sorry for the disrespect you were shown." Avery looked at the powerful officer before her, then at the half-restored engine of the historic plane. She finally spoke, her voice not angry but weary and filled with a timeless wisdom. "They're just kids, Colonel," she said, her voice low. "They see the metal, they see the rust. I see Riley, the crew chief who never made it home from our 47th mission. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it so someone remembers them, so they don't just disappear." As she spoke, the world flickered again. She was 28 years old, standing on a tarmac in Qatar. The air smelled of jet fuel and sand. A 2-star general with weary eyes was pinning the Distinguished Flying Cross on her chest. The general's voice was low, meant for her alone. "You wear this for the crew who can't, Sergeant. Don't you ever forget it." "Oh, I think you are," Gallo said, stepping closer. His shadow fell over her. "We're going to escort you off this flight line now." He noticed a small sewn patch on Avery's worn denim jacket draped over the crate. It was dark blue with a silver winged emblem at its center. It was so faded and frayed it was barely recognizable. Gallo reached out and flicked it with his finger. "What's this supposed to be, some kind of craft fair badge?" The touch, the casual, dismissive flick against the patch was what did it. The world around Avery seemed to warp and shimmer. The hot air of the tarmac was replaced by the roar of turboprop engines and the acrid smell of jet fuel. The jeering voice of the airman melted into the crackle of a radio. She wasn't on a sunny airfield anymore. She was in the cargo bay of a C-130, the aircraft shuddering violently as it took enemy fire over Baghdad. The crew chief across from her, a young woman from Texas named Riley with a photo of her daughter taped to her helmet, gave her a terrified thumbs up. Then the world outside the window turned into a storm of tracer fire and smoke. The patch on her jacket, then brand new, felt heavy on her chest, a small shield against a sky full of metal. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving an ache in Avery's chest that had nothing to do with the heat. She looked at the young sergeant's smug face and saw a ghost of the ignorance she had fought against for so long. About 50 yards away, standing in the cavernous shadow of a maintenance hangar, a civilian logistics contractor named Mark had been watching the scene unfold. He'd seen the airmen swagger over and had initially thought nothing of it, but their posture, their laughter, and the woman's resolute stillness had set his teeth on edge. He knew who she was, at least by name. Ms. Mitchell, the quiet woman who had been given permission to work on the old bomber, a project everyone on base knew about, even if they didn't understand it. When he saw Gallo snatch the ID and then flick the patch on her jacket, Mark felt a cold knot of anger form in his stomach. He'd spent 6 years in the Air Force himself before taking a civilian job. He knew the look of a bully high on a little bit of rank, and when Gallo put his hand on Avery's shoulder as if to physically force her away, Mark knew he had to act. Pulling out his phone, his fingers flew across the screen. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the one he was looking for, the direct line to the base commander's administrative office. The phone was answered on the second ring. "Colonel Evans's office, Airman Davis speaking." "Airman, this is Mark Stetler from Logistics," Mark said, his voice low and urgent. He kept his eyes fixed on the confrontation across the tarmac. "I need to report a situation on the historic flight line. Some maintenance personnel are harassing Miss Mitchell, the civilian working on the B-17 restoration." There was a pause. "Harassing, sir?" "Yes, it's Staff Sergeant Gallo and a couple of his guys. They're being disrespectful, and it looks like it's about to get physical. They're treating her like a trespasser." Mark could hear the faint sound of typing on the other end. "Miss Avery Mitchell?" Airman Davis asked, a new note of concern in her voice. "That's her," Mark confirmed. "Look, I don't want to cause trouble, but this feels wrong. She's just trying to work, and these kids are treating her like dirt." "Understood, Mr. Stetler. Please stand by. The colonel needs to know about this immediately." Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Help was on the way. He just hoped it would get there in time. Inside the sprawling headquarters building, Colonel David Evans was in the middle of a budget meeting that was making his teeth ache with boredom. His door opened just enough for his executive aide, Airman Davis, to stick her head in. She had a rule about never interrupting these meetings, so her presence meant something was wrong. "Sir," she whispered, her eyes wide, "I apologize for the interruption, but I have an urgent message from the flight line." Colonel Evans excused himself from the meeting, his annoyance plain. He stepped into his outer office, closing the door behind him. "This had better be important, Airman." "Sir, it's a call from a civilian contractor. He says some of the maintenance crew are harassing Ms. Mitchell." The name hit the air and seemed to change its composition. Every trace of annoyance vanished from the colonel's face, replaced by a sudden, cold intensity. The air in the room became still and heavy. "Avery Mitchell?" the colonel asked, his voice a low growl. "On the B-17? "Yes, sir, Staff Sergeant Gallo's team. The contractor says they're threatening to remove her from the flight line." Colonel Evans stared at his aide for a long second, his mind working furiously. Then he moved with a speed that was startling in a man his size. He strode to his desk and jabbed the intercom button. "Get my vehicle to the front door now," he barked. He then grabbed his desk phone. "Get me Wing Chief Master Sergeant Thompson. Tell him to meet me at the historic flight line 5 minutes ago. Tell him it's about Avery Mitchell." He slammed the phone down. Avery finally looked up, Her eyes, dark green and steady, held a placid depth that seemed to absorb their taunts without disturbance. She wore simple work coveralls over a faded Air Force t-shirt, the kind of clothes that had seen years of honest labor. She said nothing, simply turned her attention back to the engine. Her silence was a wall they seemed determined to breach. The young airmen, a small group of 3 from the maintenance crew on the far side of the field, had wandered over during their break. They were used to working on sleek gray F-22s and massive C-5 Galaxies, machines of quiet, deadly efficiency. This hulking metallic relic was a joke to them, and the woman tending to it was the punchline. "What do you even think you're doing?" Gallo asked, stepping closer. He kicked one of the massive tires, the rubber thick and cracked with age. The dull thud echoed in the quiet. "Think you're going to get this rust bucket flying with a YouTube tutorial and a prayer?" His 2 companions snickered. They circled the aircraft, their modern sand-colored boots scuffing the sun-baked tarmac. They pointed at the faded nose art, a barely visible painting of a determined-looking eagle with the words Iron Phoenix painted in peeling script beneath it. "Iron Phoenix," one of them read aloud, laughing. "Sounds about right, looks dead to me." Avery's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible ripple along her weathered skin. She continued her work, her movements economical and precise. She picked up a wrench, her knuckles steady as she found the perfect purchase on a rusted bolt. To them, she was a hobbyist playing dress-up. To her, this was a sacred duty. Each bolt tightened, each patch of corrosion removed, was a prayer for the crews who had called planes like this home. She wasn't restoring a machine, she was resurrecting a memory. Gallo, annoyed by the lack of reaction, stepped directly into Avery's path, blocking her access to the engine. "I'm talking to you. I need to see your authorization. Your base pass, your ID. Who let you out here?" Avery slowly set her wrench down on a nearby crate. She reached into the pocket of her coveralls and pulled out a worn card holder. She fumbled with it for a moment, pulling out a laminated card. The airmen exchanged impatient glances. The sun was hot, beating down on the concrete, and their break was almost over. This was no longer fun. It was becoming an annoyance. "Come on, ma'am, we haven't got all day." Gallo pressed, his voice losing its mocking tone and taking on a harder, more authoritative edge. He was a staff sergeant after all. He had stripes on his arm and authority to wield, especially over a confused civilian woman. Avery finally produced the card. It was a base pass issued by the Community Relations Office, granting her access to the historic flight line. It was faded but perfectly valid. Gallo snatched it from her hand. He squinted at the photo, then at Avery's face.
"Avery Mitchell."
"Well, Miss Mitchell, this just says you can be here. It doesn't say you can play mechanic on government property. This aircraft is a museum piece. You can't just start taking it apart." "I have permission," Avery said, her voice low, unused to conflict. "From the base commander." Gallo let out a short, incredulous laugh. "The base commander? Colonel Evans? You have his personal permission to tinker with a multi-million-dollar historical asset?" He scoffed. "Sure you do, and I'm the next chief of staff of the Air Force." He handed the ID back with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Look, I don't know what story you spun to get this pass, but your little adventure is over. You're a liability. What if you fell off that wing? What if you started a fire? It's time for you to go." Avery stood her ground, her gaze drifting back to the engine. "I'm not finished."